What happens when men believe they can build heaven with blood? Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight's event story takes us to the heart of 19th century China, a land trembling between dynasties and dreams. It is a story of faith turned to fire, of a vision so radiant it blinded those who followed it. This is the story of the Taiping Rebellion, when men tried to claim the kingdom of heaven and found themselves standing in its ashes. The wind moved like a ghost through the rice fields of Guangxi, bending the stalks as if in prayer. A young peasant named Liang Shun wiped the sweat from his neck and looked toward the hills. From there, strange hymns echoed, not Buddhist chants, nor the imperial drums of the Qing. The words were half Chinese, half foreign, about a heavenly father who promised a kingdom without hunger or pain. Liang's wife Meilan whispered, "They say the man leading them is the brother of Jesus." He laughed softly. "Then why is he gathering soldiers?" Neither of them knew that this brother of Jesus, Hong Shuquan, had once been a failed scholar, a man who, after repeated humiliation in the imperial exams, saw visions of golden palaces and angels in robes of fire. In those visions, he claimed, God crowned him the heavenly king and commanded him to cleanse China of demons, the Manchu rulers, the idols, the corruption. To the poor, his words were light. To the empire, they were thunder. Months later, Liang's village burned in that thunder. The Taiping banners, crimson with the words, Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, filled the valley. Liang was conscripted before sunrise. He was given a bamboo spear and a white headband painted with a cross. "Brother," said the recruiter, "you're one of God's chosen now." The irony would only reach Liang years later, when his hands, once calloused by harvest, were blackened by soot and blood. Far away, in the treaty port of Canton, a British missionary named Reverend Arthur Fenton read the same reports with trembling fingers. He had come to China to spread the gospel, but what he read in Hong's proclamations filled him with unease. Hong spoke of Jesus, yes, but his scripture twisted into a creed of vengeance. He ordered temples destroyed, families separated, men and women divided into camps of heavenly brothers and heavenly sisters. Fenton wrote in his journal, "I cannot discern whether I witness a divine revival or the devil quoting scripture." When foreign merchants asked him what he thought of the uprising, he hesitated. "It carries the name of Christ," he said, "but not his heart." By 1851, the rebellion had grown into an army of hundreds of thousands. Villages emptied, fields turned to graves. Liang marched north with other peasants, barefoot soldiers who believed that heaven had chosen them to purify the land. They sang hymns as they burned idols and granaries alike. One night, camped by the Yangtze River, Liang sat beside an older soldier named Bao Ren. Bao whispered, "We were promised peace, yet all I see is smoke." Liang stared at the river, reflecting torchlight like liquid fire. "Maybe peace comes after the cleansing." So that Bao shook his head, "Or maybe heaven has turned its face away." The next morning, Bao was gone, vanished into the mist or into the grave. Meanwhile, in Nanjing, the great city of emperors, Hong Shuquan claimed his throne. He renamed it Tianjing, heavenly capital. Silk banners draped its walls, choirs sang in strange new hymns, and yet behind the gates, suspicion festered. Hong locked himself in the inner palace, issuing edicts that no man could question. He called himself Son of God, his followers, children of heaven. But hunger soon gnawed even in the heavenly capital. Reverend Fenton traveled upriver hoping to negotiate mercy for civilians. What he found instead chilled him. Execution yards filled with those accused of demonic thinking. Starved refugees clawing for rice beneath the same walls that proclaimed divine equality. He wrote again in his diary, "I looked upon a city that named itself heaven and found only man." Outside those walls, Liang now led a platoon. He no longer prayed before battles. He only remembered the echo of his wife's voice when she'd said, "They say the man leading them is the brother of Jesus." Every night, he wondered if she still lived in the ruins of their village. Every dawn, he watched another boy die beneath a banner of peace. And somewhere in the smoke-thick horizon, a question hung like an unburied ghost. When does faith stop saving and start destroying? He didn't know it yet, but the answer would find him in the heart of the burning city, where heaven itself would fall silent. The streets of Tianjin, the heavenly capital, smelled of incense, sweat, and iron. The city that had once hummed with merchants and mandarins now pulsed with the tramp of soldiers singing hymns that sounded like psalms, but ended with the crack of rifles. Liang Shun's unit entered the western gate beneath banners painted with verses, "God's kingdom shall reign forever." He had dreamed of golden palaces. Instead, he saw beggars kneeling in mud, pleading for bread stamped with the seal of heaven. Inside the city, every building wore scripture like armor. Doorposts bore commandments written in red ink. No opium, no gambling, no unchaste thought. Yet behind shuttered windows, secret markets still traded. Rice, wine, rumors sin had not left. It had only changed its uniform. At dawn, a trumpet called the faithful to assembly. From a gilded balcony, Hong Shuquan appeared, pale and distant. He no longer preached in the open squares. The proclamations were read aloud by ministers, while he stood motionless, his silk robe embroidered with suns and crosses. "Heaven's wrath burns against the demons," one decree thundered. "All who doubt shall be purified in fire." Liang looked at the faces around him, farmers, ex-scholars, widows, all nodding as if truth had descended. He wondered if they heard the same tremor he did in the herald's voice, fear disguised as faith. That night he wrote 3 characters in the dust beside his cot. "Peace where?" Then he brushed them away before anyone could see. Beyond the city walls, Reverend Arthur Fenton traveled upriver by steamer with a single lantern and a Bible whose cover had been blackened by smoke. The mission in Canton had begged him not to go, but something in his conscience insisted he witness the uprising himself, to see whether God's name was being glorified or profaned. The boatman who ferried him was silent until the second night, when cannon fire flickered on the horizon. "Do you believe this Heaven King is a holy man?" Fenton asked. The boatman spat into the water. "Heaven? If heaven were near, it would have drowned us all by now." Fenton bowed his head. "Perhaps it will." He remembered the verse he had taught to converts years ago. "Blessed are the peacemakers." Yet every shore he passed was littered with burned shrines and corpses. The word had spread, but without love. It had multiplied like fire instead of light. In Tianjin, new edicts forbade laughter in the streets. Music outside of hymns was sin. Colors other than white or crimson were pride. Even children marched in ranks, chanting prayers they did not understand. Liang's commander, General Yang Xiuqing, claimed to hear the voice of God himself in his dreams. When he spoke, even Hong bowed. But whispers spread. Yang's revelations always benefited his own power. One night, Liang was ordered to guard the outer courtyard, while Yang met privately with his officers. Through the wooden screens, he heard the general's tone change. Less divine, more human, hungry. "The heavenly king grows weak," Yang said. "If heaven truly speaks through me, then perhaps heaven should rule directly." Liang pressed his back to the wall, heart pounding. The city that called itself heaven was now ruled by men who spoke of heaven only to reach the throne. A week later, the rebellion turned inward. Yang was found dead, his body hacked apart by soldiers loyal to Hong. The gates were sealed. Executions filled the squares. Those who questioned the purge were branded doubters of God. Liang was ordered to drag corpses to the river. Among them, he saw the face of a teacher who had once read scripture to the children. As dusk fell, crimson light bathed the waters. He knelt at the riverbank, hands trembling, and whispered, "If you are watching, why so silent?" A single drop of rain struck the back of his hand. Then another. Within minutes, a storm drenched the city, washing blood from the stones. Liang took it as answer, not forgiveness, but warning. Reverend Fenton reached the outskirts the following morning. He climbed a ridge overlooking Tianjin and saw smoke rising from within. To the west, refugees streamed toward him, women clutching infants, boys dragging sacks of grain. One old man collapsed at his feet, gasping. "They said heaven would feed us," he wheezed. "Heaven fed only its generals." Fenton tore a page from his journal and scribbled, "Faith without mercy is tyranny." He handed the man a crust of bread, the last of his rations. For a moment their eyes met. A missionary who had come to save souls, and a soul who no longer believed salvation existed. Inside Tianjin, Hong declared the storm a sign of divine approval for the purge. He ordered 3 days of celebration, while famine spread through the outer wards. Liang watched soldiers dance around bonfires made of confiscated furniture. Flames licked the sky. Smoke choked the stars. He remembered his wife's garden, the scent of wet earth after rain, and wondered how many seasons he had missed. His sergeant passed by and muttered, "Heaven's kingdom." More like hell politely dressed. Liang almost smiled, the first time in years, but the smile faded when the sergeant was arrested that night for mocking the divine order. By midsummer 1853, the city glistened like a jewel of madness. Thousands of converts poured in, fleeing imperial armies only to find hunger behind holy walls. Hong issued new laws. No trade with outsiders, no travel without heavenly seal. Tianjin became both paradise and prison. Liang stood on watch atop the walls as lightning veined the sky. Each flash revealed the faces of starving refugees pressed against the gates below, their cries swallowed by thunder. He whispered, "If this is heaven, may the earth never see it." And in that instant, between lightning and darkness, he felt something shift inside him. Not rebellion, not disbelief, but a quiet clarity. Heaven could not be built by men who forgot compassion. He turned his gaze toward the horizon where imperial banners flickered in the distance, and wondered which was worse, the empire of greed or the kingdom of pride. He would soon learn that both were the same storm, and he was standing in its eye. Smoke threaded the morning like a bad dream that refused to lift. Within Tianjin, new verses were painted over old decrees, each proclamation darker than the last. The words promised purity. The streets tasted of ash. Liang Shun woke to the scrape of boots outside his barracks and the sharp report of a drum. A messenger unrolled a scroll and read that heaven had exposed new traitors, 30 names. Among them, the sergeant who had once dared a tired joke. The listed men were dragged to the southern square. Crowds gathered, children were hoisted onto shoulders to watch righteousness at work. Liang could not bring himself to stand with them. He lingered behind an alley door and listened instead. There was no sermon, only the thud of bodies, the rush of rainwater across stone, the murmur of a crowd deciding whether to cheer. He pressed his forehead to the wood and whispered, "Forgive me," unsure to whom he spoke, God, the dead, or himself. But what happens to a man when his lips pray and his hands obey orders that break him? By noon, banners snapped at every gate. God hates doubt. The words were red as a wound. The city, a place that promised to erase sin, had begun to erase people. That evening, Liang's unit was posted to the outer ward, where rice stores were locked behind new iron bars. A woman in a gray shawl approached, carrying a boy whose ribs pressed like reeds against his skin. "Just a handful," she said. "We believed. We came. Please." Liang looked at the seal on the storehouse door, the stylized cross painted like a threat. He could feel the eyes of the other guards. He could feel hunger breathing from the boy's open mouth. He said, "Move along. There is rationing." He hated his voice for sounding like the decree. The boy reached out. His fingers touched Liang's sleeve and left a pale smear of dust. Liang's throat burned. "Move along," he repeated, and watched them go until the alley swallowed them both. That night the dust smear remained on his sleeve, like a fingerprint he could not wash away. He didn't know then, but that small, pleading hand would be the last straw on a conscience already bent to breaking. Up on the ridge east of the city, Reverend Arthur Fenton kept a vigil that felt like penance. The refugees he had helped were now scattered along the riverbank. He moved from blanket to blanket with a tin cup and verses that suddenly seemed fragile. A Qing patrol appeared at dusk. Blue coats, braided queues, faces grim. Their captain, Zhao Wen, eyed Fenton's collar and the blackened Bible. "Foreign priest," Zhao said, "you traffic in words. Can your words stop fire?" "No," Fenton answered, "but they can keep a man from loving it." Zhao snorted. Yet he didn't move on. He watched Fenton pour water for an old woman, wait until she finished, and then refill her cup. "We mean to retake the city," Zhao said quietly. "When we do, it will not be gentle." Fenton met his gaze. "Withdraw your cannon from the wards, where the starving are kept." "Withdraw?" Zhao's mouth tightened. "When the rebels burn villages, do they ask which houses are gentle? The empire is a net with holes. If we pull softly, the fish swim through." "And if you pull too hard," Fenton said, "the net tears, and you catch nothing but bones." Zhao's eyes narrowed. He seemed about to reply when a scout rode up, breathless, whispering of a Taiping sortie to the north bank. Zhao mounted. "Keep your words, priest," he said. "I will keep my city." He reined away, leaving Fenton with the river and a prayer he could barely form. Let mercy live somewhere in this fire. Was Zhao an enemy, or only another man drowning in orders? Fenton could not tell. He only knew that if heaven still touched earth, it did so in small, stubborn gestures, as when a soldier looked away while a loaf changed hands, or when rain arrived just in time to rinse blood from a street, so a child could walk there without seeing what adults wished to forget. Inside Tianjin, rumors moved faster than messengers. Hong Xiuquan, it was said, had taken to the inner gardens, where peach blossoms bloomed in a season that should have been austere. He bathed in scented water while new hymns were printed, each promising that those who suffered did so because their faith was impure. Faith had become a blade honed against the poor. Liang's friend Shen Wei, a thin man with quick eyes and a habit of humming forbidden folk tunes under his breath, slipped a folded scrap into Liang's palm during watch. Inside was a line from an older scripture, ink faded by many hands. "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." "Where did you get this?" Liang whispered. Shen nodded toward the makeshift infirmary. A woman came in with a fever, tucked it into her bandage. I think she wanted someone to see it before she died. "Keep it," Liang said. But Shen pushed the fragment back. "You keep it," Shen replied. "You still believe something." "Do we?" Liang wanted to ask. "Or do we only fear what happens if we stop?" 3 nights later, thunder stalked the horizon. The city gates remained shut. Edicts forbade any gathering not sanctioned by the Heavenly King. Liang and Shen were assigned to escort a supply cart from the northern ward to the armory. It should have been simple, but when the cart's tarp slid loose in a sharp gust, Liang saw not weapons, but sacks of grain, white rice, clean as snow. "Armory, Shen murmured. The driver jerked the tarp back down and cracked the reins. "Orders," he muttered, "for the inner court." The inner court, where the scent of peaches still lingered. At a crossroads, a lantern guttered. The driver jumped down to fix the pin on the axle. In the lantern's wobbling light, Liang saw movement in the alley mouth. The gray shawl, the same boy, eyes wider than hunger. The woman pointed not at the cart, but at Liang's sleeve, as if to remind him of the dust smear that had once signed his soul. Shen's voice was barely a breath. "One sack missing won't starve heaven." Liang's heart hammered like a prayer drum. He looked at the city walls, at the painted decrees, at the shadow of a cross that tilted across the street like a gallows. "If we do this," he said, "we die if we're seen." Shen shrugged. "We die if we aren't." How quickly does a man choose between law and love, when both speak in God's name? Liang tugged the tarp. His hands remembered harvest. He hefted a sack like a cradle and slid it into darkness. The woman drew it close without sound. The boy's hand, familiar as guilt and grace, touched Liang's sleeve again. This time, The touch steadied him. The driver cursed at the axle. Shen bent as if to help and loosened the hitch just enough that the cart would rattle for an hour after they left. When the lantern flared again, everything looked the same. Heaven had not thundered. No trumpet called their names. Only a thin drizzle began to fall. A whispering rain that made the stones glisten. Was it coincidence or something more? At dawn, the square was filled with new proclamations about thieves who had stolen from heaven. Rewards for informers, punishments for silence. Liang stood in formation, rain soaking his hair, the scrap of scripture warm against his ribs. General Qin Rigang, newly elevated, rode past on a black horse, eyes like shuttered windows. In heaven's kingdom, he shouted, mercy is obedience, doubt is hunger. Faith is your ration. The men roared because they had learned to. Liang's voice did not join them. He looked down and saw, in a crease of the mud at his feet, a grain of rice that the rain hadn't swept away white. Whole. Stubborn. He covered it with his boot gently, as if tucking a child in. He didn't know yet, but that single hidden grain would become a fault line in his life. The next order he received would split it open, because that night, Liang Shun would be told to set fire to the northern ward. And in that ward lived the boy with the dust finger and the woman with the gray shawl. The order arrived wrapped in red silk, sealed with wax that bore the cross of the heavenly kingdom. Liang Shun's commanding officer didn't unroll it aloud. He read in silence, face pale, then looked up and spoke softly, as if speaking too loudly might summon heaven's attention. The northern ward, he said, all structures to be purged by dawn. The inhabitants refused rationing, spread dissent. They are unclean. No one asked what purged meant. Everyone knew. Liang felt the word like a weight in his stomach. The northern ward, where he'd seen the gray-shawled woman and her son only nights ago. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Around him, the other soldiers shuffled uneasily. Obedience had become habit. Hesitation was sin. By midnight, torches hissed in the drizzle. The air smelled of pitch and fear. Liang's unit marched through narrow lanes, whose paper charms fluttered from door frames. Inside each house, silence crouched, families waiting, praying that the soldiers would pass them by. At the crossroads, Captain Ming raised his torch. "Heaven commands," he said. "Do not falter." The flames touched the first roof. Wet straw sizzled, then caught. A baby cried. Someone shouted, "Mercy!" The sound was swallowed by crackling wood. Liang stood frozen, the torch shaking in his hand. "Shun!" Ming barked. "Move!" Liang looked at the house before him. Thin walls, faint candlelight inside, the same alley where a boy's small hand had once brushed his sleeve. His throat closed. Mercy is obedience, General Qin had declared that morning. But whose obedience? To heaven, or to men who spoke in its name? He threw the torch into a puddle. Steam rose with a hiss like a sigh. "Defective faith," Ming roared. Liang turned to run. He didn't plan it. His legs simply moved faster than thought. Behind him, shouts split the rain. Arrows whined through the dark. He darted into the alley, slipping on wet stones. Hands reached from a doorway, the woman's hands pulling him inside. The boy clung to her waist, eyes wide with a terror too old for his years. "They'll kill you," she whispered. "They already have," Liang said, "every day." She pressed his hand to her chest, over a heartbeat that raced like a trapped bird. "Why did you come?" He didn't know how to answer. He only knew he couldn't stand another sunrise built on screams. The house shook as another roof collapsed nearby. Smoke forced its way under the door. "Follow me," she said, lifting a loose plank from the floor. Beneath it gaped a storage pit half filled with dried grain. "It leads to the drainage canal. Go while you can." Liang hesitated. "And you?" Her eyes glistened. "He can't run fast. I'll slow you down." The boy clutched her sleeve. "Mama!" She bent and kissed his hair. "Heaven hears everything," she whispered. "Maybe tonight it will remember us." Liang crouched, voice rough. "I'll take him. If I don't, both of you die." Hey! For a moment, she searched his face as though weighing whether mercy could be trusted from a soldier of heaven. Then she nodded once fiercely and pushed the child toward him. "Run," she said. "Don't look back." The canal was narrow and foul, but it led north beneath the walls. Liang crawled until the air thickened with smoke, and the roar of burning joined the thunder. Behind him, flames painted the sky orange. He pressed forward, dragging the boy by the wrist until they reached an iron grate slick with rainwater. Beyond it, darkness, freedom, maybe both. He braced his shoulder and shoved. The rusted bars groaned, then gave way with a shriek that felt too loud. He pulled the boy through and tumbled into the open fields beyond Tianjin. The ground steamed from the night's rain. Behind them, the heavenly capital glowed like a furnace. The boy shivered. "Is my mother coming?" Liang looked at the horizon where fire met clouds. He could not lie. "She will find you," he said. "Maybe not tonight, but heaven does not forget." The boy's tears mingled with the drizzle. Liang gathered him close and walked toward the river where faint lights flickered. Imperial campfires, maybe missionaries, maybe death. He didn't care. The city of heaven was burning. Perhaps hell could offer shelter. At the riverbank, Liang collapsed beside a half-sunken boat. The boy slept against his chest, breath shallow. The rain eased into mist. For the first time in years, Liang prayed, not to the heavenly king, but to the quiet between thunderclaps. "If you still listen," he murmured, "teach me which fire cleanses and which only consumes." A voice answered, not divine, but human and weary. "You'll find that lesson costs more than sleep." Liang jerked upright. A lantern bobbed nearby, revealing a gaunt man in a torn clerical collar. Reverend Arthur Fenton. The missionary looked like a ghost risen from exhaustion, his Bible tucked beneath one arm, his other hand holding the lantern low. "Who are you?" Liang asked. "Someone who believed words could save men from themselves," Fenton said. "Someone very wrong." He knelt, peering at the boy. "You came from the city?" Liang nodded. "I burned my uniform. They'll call me traitor." "Then we are brothers," Fenton said softly. "They call me the same." From the opposite bank came a dull thunder, the first test shots of the Imperial siege. Cannon smoke unfurled across the water like a shroud. Fenton lifted his eyes to the glow above Tianjin. "Do you think God still lives there?" he asked. Liang watched the city's spires crumble under firelight. "If he ever did," he said, "he's walking away tonight." But even as he spoke, a single streak of lightning split the clouds. Not toward the city, but toward the river where they sat. It struck far off, illuminating the valley in white for an instant. In that heartbeat of brightness, the fires looked like lanterns, the ruins like altars, and the rain, merciful, endless rain, fell heavier, as if heaven wept too. Liang didn't yet understand, but one day he would remember that image whenever he prayed. The night heaven cried without words, and while the city burned behind them, the siege began. A storm from without to match the fire within. Liang would soon learn that salvation demanded a different kind of surrender. The dawn after the fire came cold and gray. A thin mist clung to the reeds by the riverbank, veiling corpses and driftwood alike. From across the water, Tianjin's towers rose like teeth, black, broken, steaming from their night of judgment. Liang Shun woke to the rattle of cannon fire and the child's trembling hand gripping his sleeve. The boy whispered, "Mama." Liang swallowed hard. "Rest," he said. "We'll find her." But the words turned bitter on his tongue. Every promise he'd made lately had ended in smoke. On the opposite shore, Reverend Arthur Fenton crouched beside a wounded Imperial scout, his fingers slick with blood. The scout had been hit by stray shrapnel, one of their own shells that had fallen short. Fenton tore a strip from his sleeve and bound the wound. The soldier's breath came in short, panicked bursts. "They said, the rebels, they call their city heaven." Fenton nodded. "Heaven built by men always burns fastest." The scout stared past him at the fog. "Then where's the real one?" Fenton paused, the bandage tightening under his hands. Maybe, he said quietly, it's what's left after we stop pretending to own it. By noon, the Imperial camp was a restless sprawl of tents and artillery. Fenton guided Liang and the boy through the outer ranks, careful not to draw attention. To the soldiers, all who fled the heavenly kingdom were suspect, but famine had softened even suspicion. No one stopped a missionary with a bleeding child. A major intercepted them near a supply wagon. "You, foreigner! You've been seen near the rebel lines before. Spy or savior?" Fenton's Mandarin faltered, but his gaze held steady. "Neither," he said. "Just a fool who still believes God can live among ruins." The major's laugh was harsh. "Then you'll fit right in." He gestured at Liang. "And him?" Fenton said, "A deserter who found mercy." The officer studied Liang's face, the hollows beneath his eyes, the grime of ash. He nodded once. "Mercy is a word for those who still have food. Feed your God before he starves." He tossed them a small cloth bag, hardtack, moldy rice, and walked away. The gift was contempt, but Liang bowed nonetheless. When the major disappeared, Fenton exhaled. "You'll need to stay out of sight. Once the cannons breach the walls, this place will drown in its own justice." Liang looked back at the burning horizon. "Justice," he murmured. "That's what they called it inside, too." For 3 days, the imperial bombardment continued. Each sunrise revealed less of Tianjin. Rooftops caved in, bridges gone, the city's outer walls bleeding smoke. Between barrages, small bands of refugees crossed the river on makeshift rafts. Some were shot midstream, others collapsed on shore, whispering prayers from both sides of faith. Fenton moved among them with the calm of a man whose heart had broken long ago and found new purpose in the fragments. He shared water, wrapped wounds, murmured fragments of psalms. Liang helped, wordless. The boy, whose name he learned was Yuan, followed him like a shadow. On the 4th evening, Yuan tugged at Liang's sleeve. "The man with the book," he said, pointing to Fenton. "He prays even when he knows no one answers." Liang smiled faintly. "Then he prays like the rest of us." In the Imperial command tent, Captain Zhaowen stood over a map, stained with rainwater and ink. He traced a line with his finger. "Tomorrow, we push through the east gate. No quarter. We cleanse this disease." Fenton was summoned there as an interpreter. When he entered, the air was thick with tobacco and certainty. "Missionary," Zhao said, "you've seen their city. Tell us what waits inside." "Famine," Fenton answered. "Fear. 1,000 souls too weak to lift a weapon." "Then the faster we strike, the faster it ends." Fenton hesitated. "End or repeat?" The officers muttered. Zhao's jaw tightened. "You question imperial order?" "I question whether killing the starving feeds heaven or hell," Fenton said softly. Zhao's hand twitched toward his sword. "Your mercy is foreign," he said. "Here, mercy feeds rebellion." Fenton met his eyes. "Then rebellion must be the only thing still alive." Zhao's expression flickered, something between anger and recognition. He turned away. "Leave the tent, priest, before my men mistake you for one of them." Outside, Fenton stood in the drizzle and watched his breath mist into the cold air. He felt the weight of his Bible under his arm, heavier than ever. Perhaps, he thought, words were not given to stop wars, but to stop the soul from dying inside them. That night, Liang sat with Yuan beside the river. The boy clutched a crust of bread, unwilling to eat it, yet unwilling to let go. "Was your mother good?" Liang asked. Yuan nodded. "She said heaven doesn't live in walls or crowns. She said it hides in people who remember kindness." Liang stared at the reflections of fire on the water. "Then maybe heaven hasn't fallen yet." Yuan tilted his head. "How will we find it?" "By surviving long enough to see what's left," Liang said. Past midnight, the cannon fire ceased. An unnatural silence rolled over the fields. Fenton emerged from his tent and looked toward Tianjin. In the faint moonlight, he saw movement, a line of refugees leaving the city under a white banner. he whispered. They're surrendering. Before he could signal to Zhao's guards, a flare streaked from the imperial trenches, then another and another. Arrows of flame arced across the sky, falling among the civilians. Screams tore through the mist. Liang bolted upright. They're not soldiers, he shouted. But the guns answered. He sprinted into the dark, Fenton following, shouting until his voice broke. Smoke swallowed them both. When they reached the shore, the water boiled with panic. Men and women thrashing, clutching infants, struck down by stray shots. Yuan clung to Liang's leg, sobbing. Fenton waded in, dragging a wounded girl to land. Tell them to stop, he gasped. They can't hear you, Liang said. They don't want to. Then came a sound like thunder under the earth. The east wall collapsing. Flames rose higher than temples. The siege had begun in earnest. Fenton looked toward the inferno. God forgive us, he whispered. We've mistaken conquest for cleansing. Liang lifted Yuan into his arms and turned away from the city that had once promised heaven. Maybe, he said, this is the only way heaven reminds us. We're not gods. Behind them, Tianjin burned brighter than dawn. Ash fell like snow over the river, soft and silent. Fenton's voice trembled. It looks almost beautiful. Liang's eyes glistened. So did the lie. The siege of Tianjin would rage for months, but that night was its soul. The night mercy drowned in its own river, and in that drowning, something in Liang and Fenton began to awaken, a faint, stubborn faith, not in men, but in the God they had all failed to hear. The siege ground on like a storm that forgot to end. By the second month, Tianjin was no longer a city, but a carcass of its own faith. The walls gaped open where cannonballs had chewed them raw, and the air hung thick with smoke and flies. From the hills, even heaven looked diseased. Liang Shun and Reverend Arthur Fenton moved among the camps of refugees that spread like bruises along the river. The imperial lines crept closer every day, choking off escape. And though the rebels were nearly broken, the empire showed no mercy, because victory without vengeance, it seemed, was too small a god to worship. Yuan coughed beside a dying fire. His small shoulders heaved with every breath. Liang wrapped him in his own tattered cloak, though it did little against the wind. He needs food, Liang said. Fenton nodded, his face gray with exhaustion. And I need a miracle that doesn't come with conditions. He rose and crossed to a group of imperial quartermasters arguing beside an overturned wagon. These children, he began in careful Mandarin, will not live till morning if you... Move along, priest, one barked. These rations are for soldiers. Fenton held out a coin, one of the last he had kept from his mission fund. Then sell me mercy. The officer laughed. You think heaven takes silver? No, Fenton said, but sometimes men do. The officer hesitated, then snatched the coin. A handful of rice landed in Fenton's palm, fewer grains than his prayers had words. Still, he carried it back as though it were gold. Liang crushed it into a thin paste and fed it to Yuan spoon by spoon. The boy smiled weakly and whispered, It tastes like rain. Fenton exhaled. That's the first kind thing I've heard in months. At dusk, thunder rumbled from the east. Not cannon this time. Real thunder. Clouds massed over the horizon, swollen and black. As the first drops fell, the soldiers cursed. The refugees lifted their faces. Rain blurred the boundary between conquerors and conquered, washing the soot from skin until all looked equally human. Liang stared at the gray wall of water and felt something shift inside him again. Every sermon he'd heard in Tianjin had spoken of purification by flame. But perhaps heaven had always worked through rain. Soft, relentless, impossible to command. Fenton must have read the thought in his eyes. Fire makes men fear God, he said quietly. Rain makes them remember him. Lightning forked across the river. For an instant, Tianjin shone white, its ruined towers, the shattered cross still jutting from the palace roof, the wide courtyards filled with ash. Then darkness reclaimed it. The next morning brought a new decree from the imperial command. All remaining rebels, women and children within the city, to be exterminated by sundown. It was signed by Captain Zhao Wen himself. When Fenton read it, the parchment trembled in his hand. Exterminated? He repeated. That word was meant for rats. Zhao's expression did not change. Then, let it remind them what they have become. You call it justice, Fenton said, but you are doing what they did, burning faith into fear. Zhao's tone hardened. Priest, do not mistake pity for wisdom. They poisoned the empire for years. If I leave a single spark alive, it will burn again. And what of the children? Fenton demanded. Will you call their screams smoke too? The tent fell silent. Rain ticked against canvas like nervous fingers. Zhao looked away. I have orders, he said. We both serve masters who don't answer us anymore. He left before Fenton could reply. That afternoon, Liang heard the same decree shouted through the camps. The words struck like hammer blows. He remembered the faces of the people still trapped inside, the starving, the widowed, the mad. And he knew that if the empire had its way, by nightfall heaven's capital would be a grave. He found Fenton pacing by the riverbank. They're marching at dusk, Liang said. If we go now, we might reach the southern wall before they do. To do what? Fenton asked. Find whoever's left. Get them out. Fenton stared at him for a long moment. You'd walk back into the fire? Liang's jaw tightened. I've lived in it long enough to know the difference between burning for God and burning with him. The missionary looked at the ruined skyline. Then he nodded. I suppose this is where faith stops being words. They crossed under cover of rain, rowing a stolen skiff across the swollen river. The thunder drowned the sound of paddles. Inside the city, the streets were rivers of mud and ash. Charred door frames jutted like ribs from the earth. Here and there, voices cried out from half-collapsed cellars. Liang found a girl huddled beneath a broken shrine, her hands black with soot. Fenton lifted her into the boat. Two more followed, a mother and her infant, too weak to protest. Each rescue felt like defiance, whispered against the roar of empire. By the fifth trip, the rain had turned to sheets. Lightning revealed imperial banners closing in from the east. Cannon flashes lit the sky like angry stars. We can't take more, Fenton gasped as they loaded the last child. The current's too strong. Liang glanced back at the city gate. Through the downpour, he saw movement, a figure staggering toward them, half covered by a gray shawl. His heart stopped. Meilin? He breathed. But when the woman fell to her knees before him, he realized it wasn't his wife. It was the boy's mother, alive, bleeding, clutching her arm. Yuan, she croaked. Is he... Liang turned to the boat. Yuan's eyes widened, disbelief breaking into a smile that split the rain. Mama! Fenton caught the woman's arm. We have to go now! The thunder cracked again. From behind them came the low growl of approaching troops. Liang hoisted her into the skiff and pushed off, the current seizing them. Arrows hissed into the water. Like angry snakes, Yuan screamed as one pierced the gunwale. Hold on, Fenton shouted. Don't look back. But Liang did. Over his shoulder, Tianjin glowed one last time, each burning temple reflected in the storm-swollen river. The sight carved itself into him, a memory of men who built heaven, only to destroy it in God's name. The rain thickened, the city faded, and for a heartbeat, a brief, trembling heartbeat, it seemed to Liang that the thunder sounded not like fury, but forgiveness. By dawn, Tianjin would fall. But beneath the sound of its ruin, something else began. A quiet reckoning in the hearts of those who survived. A fragile seed of faith that no army could root out. The sun rose through smoke. The siege guns had fallen silent, leaving Tianjin to smolder under a gray sky that seemed too tired to grieve. The heavenly capital was gone. Its walls split, its palaces hollow, its courtyards filled with mud where prayers had once been sung. By dawn, the imperial banners waved over ruins that smelled of iron and ash. The conquerors had claimed their victory, yet when the soldiers marched through the gates, they found no joy waiting to greet them, only the silence of what men had done in God's name. Liang Shun stood on the far bank of the river, watching the smoke drift west. His body ached from rowing through the night. His hands were raw. But Yuan slept safely beside his mother, beneath a torn blanket. Reverend Fenton sat nearby, Bible closed on his knees, staring into the fog as though trying to read something no longer written there. "They'll call it peace now," Liang said. Fenton's voice was hoarse. "And perhaps by tomorrow they'll call it God's will." The missionary turned the Bible over in his hands. Its leather cover was scorched, the edges brittle. "I used to think faith was a light, something to carry through darkness. But now I think it's the darkness itself that teaches us how to see." Liang looked at him. "You sound like one of our old teachers." Fenton smiled faintly. "Then, perhaps we both learned the same lesson too late." By midday, Imperial patrols began sweeping the countryside, rounding up survivors. Word spread that the Emperor wanted none spared from the Heavenly Kingdom's remnant. Liang and Fenton hid the refugees in the flooded reeds, wrapping the babies in cloth to stifle their cries. Rain still drizzled, soft but endless, as if heaven refused to show its face. When the soldiers came down the path, Liang whispered to Yuan's mother, "Stay low." He and Fenton rose slowly, stepping out into the open road before the patrol could reach the reeds. The officer leading them reined his horse sharply. His armor gleamed dull bronze. "Identify yourselves." "Missionary," Fenton said calmly, "and a local guide. We are caring for the sick." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Your sick hide in these reeds. The Emperor has ordered no survivors from Tianjin. The plague of rebellion must end with the last breath." Fenton met his gaze. "Then your Emperor wages war against ghosts." The officer snorted, gesturing to his men. "Search!" Liang's stomach knotted. The reeds shivered as soldiers advanced with spears. Every heartbeat felt like a century. He whispered, "Lord, blind their eyes." And somehow they passed by. One soldier turned his head as though catching a whisper, then shook it off and moved on. The reeds stood still again. Fenton exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. The officer called, "Nothing here but river rot." "Then move," he barked, and the column tramped onward. Liang looked toward the sky. The rain had stopped. A single beam of sunlight broke through the clouds and fell across the river, catching on the wet reeds like glass. Fenton followed his gaze. "You asked last night which fire cleanses," he said. "Perhaps it's the one that leaves mercy alive." They waited until evening before moving the refugees south, toward the hills beyond the imperial reach. Each step was slow, heavy. Hunger gnawed, and the stench of ruin followed like a shadow. But they walked anyway because walking was life. Yuan stumbled often, but his mother held him steady. "It's all right," she whispered. "Heaven is everywhere. The ground forgives our footprints." Liang overheard and thought of the first time he had believed that. The young farmer in the field before war, before banners, before he thought heaven could be built with walls. He felt something warm sting his eyes and did not wipe it away. That night they camped beneath a grove of charred willows. Fenton opened his Bible, its pages curled and blackened. He tore out one, just one, and fed it to the small fire for light. The flame rose softly, no longer the roar of armies, but a humble warmth. Yuan climbed into Liang's lap. "Did heaven lose?" he asked. Liang hesitated. "No," he said finally. "Heaven doesn't fight the way we do." Yuan frowned. "Then who won?" Fenton answered without lifting his eyes from the fire. "Whoever still knows what love is." The words hung there, fragile as smoke. The refugees around them fell silent. Even the wind seemed to listen. When dawn came again, the smoke from Tianjin had faded into the horizon. Birds returned to the riverbanks, picking through debris for seeds. The Empire had already begun rewriting the story. Pamphlets distributed in nearby towns spoke of a holy victory, a divine cleansing, a nation restored. Fenton folded one of the leaflets and tucked it into his journal beside his own notes. "They'll build temples again," he said, "and preach peace while sharpening swords beneath the altar." Liang adjusted the straps on the cart carrying Yuan and his mother. "Then let's build something smaller," he said. "Something that can't burn." Fenton looked at him. "What?" Liang smiled faintly. "A life that remembers." Later that day, they reached the high plain overlooking the river. From there, the ruins of the heavenly capital were only a smudge of gray against the distance. Fenton stopped, removed his hat, and bowed his head. "May God forgive us," he whispered. "We tried to build heaven and only proved how far it is." Liang placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it isn't far," he said. "Maybe it's only quiet." They stood there as the wind rose, carrying the scent of wet earth and smoke. In that silence, neither man felt alone. And so the war ended not with a trumpet, but with a whisper, the sound of two broken souls discovering that faith does not live in victories or banners, but in the mercy left standing when the fire's done. The rains came late that year, but when they came, they didn't stop. By the time the refugees reached the southern valleys, the fields were green again, and the sound of thunder no longer meant war. It meant something growing beneath the earth. Liang Shun looked over the new camp they'd built between two hills. The makeshift tents, the clay ovens, the lines of smoke curling from cooking fires. None of it resembled the heavenly kingdom's perfection. Yet for the first time in years, he saw smiles that didn't hide behind fear. Reverend Fenton had fashioned a small cross from driftwood and rope, but he kept it hidden under his coat. "Faith," he said once, "shouldn't need a flag." Liang agreed. When men raise flags for heaven, they usually start a war. Each day more survivors arrived, ragged, haunted, and carrying stories like stones in their hearts. Some had escaped imperial retribution. Others had been spared by soldiers too weary to kill. They brought news that the emperor had declared the rebellion officially extinguished. The heavenly king, Hong Xiuquan, was dead. Whether by poison, starvation, or his own despair, no one knew. "Heaven fell," one man muttered bitterly, "and it fell on us." Fenton responded softly, "No, heaven was never in that city. Only the echo of a dream." Liang thought of the banners, the hymns, the blind conviction that had carried him from his village to ruin. "Dreams," he said, "are dangerous when they don't make room for mercy." The weeks passed. Yuan's mother, Lin Mei, grew weaker. A fever settled in her chest, the slow kind that hides behind moments of strength. She insisted she was fine, even as the coughs deepened. One evening, as Liang returned from collecting firewood, he found her sitting by the stream, washing the boy's clothes in silence. The sunset painted the water gold, the same hue that once bled from Tianjing's flames. "You should rest," Liang said. She smiled faintly. "Rest is what the dead do. The living must keep washing what the fire touched." He sat beside her. "You've carried too much." "We all did," she replied. "But I still have something to hold, my son. You lost your wife, didn't you?" Liang nodded. "I lost more than her. I lost the man she married." Lin Mei dipped her hands into the stream. "Perhaps heaven didn't turn away. Perhaps it waited for us to look up again." Liang looked toward the distant mountains, their peaks glowing in the fading light. "If heaven waited," he said quietly, "it was patient, beyond understanding." That night, thunder rolled over the hills. Yuan couldn't sleep. He crawled out of his tent and sat beside Liang, who tended the fire. "I don't like thunder," he whispered. Liang smiled. "Neither did I. But someone told me once that rain is how heaven remembers us." "Does it still remember her?" Yuan asked, glancing toward his mother's tent. Liang hesitated. "Always." When he looked up, Fenton stood a few steps away, his face caught in the firelight. "Sometimes," the missionary said, "the hardest mercy God gives us is letting someone rest." Liang stared into the flames. "And the hardest faith is learning to live after." By morning, Lin Mei's fever had broken, only not in the way anyone hoped. She lay still, her hand folded over a piece of cloth. Yuan clutched her arm, whispering for her to wake. Liang knelt, tears falling before he knew they'd come. Fenton closed his eyes and began to pray in English, the words soft and trembling. "Lord, grant her the peace we never found on earth." When he finished, Liang took the cloth from her hand. It was a small scrap from one of the heavenly kingdom's banners, burned at the edges. Across it, faint and smudged, was written in charcoal, "Mercy is not surrender." Liang read it aloud. Fenton touched his shoulder. She understood before any of us. They buried her by the stream, where the willow roots drank deeply. The refugees gathered, heads bowed. Yuen stood silently between Liang and Fenton, gripping both their hands. When the first drops of rain fell, no one moved to hide. It felt right that heaven should weep with them. That evening, Fenton sat beside Liang at the fire. His voice was low. "I've decided to leave China." Liang turned sharply. "You're leaving?" "I've written my report to the mission board. They'll send others soon, men who preach louder, judge harder. I can't be that man anymore." "Then what will you do?" Fenton stared at the embers. "Go home, perhaps. But I'm not sure where that is now. The gospel I came to bring, I think I found it here, among ashes." Liang nodded slowly. "And I thought I was saving heaven. Turns out heaven was saving me." They shared a quiet laugh, one born not of joy, but of weary understanding. Before dawn, Fenton packed his journal, Bible, and a pouch of soil from Lin Mei's grave. Yuen watched silently, then handed him a small river stone. "So you won't forget us?" the boy said. Fenton took it reverently. "Some memories don't need reminders." As he started down the valley road, Liang called after him. "Reverend," Fenton turned. "If you ever write of us," Liang said, "don't call it the fall of heaven." Fenton smiled, eyes glistening. "Then what should I call it?" Liang looked at the eastern sky, where the first light broke through the clouds. "Call it the day heaven learned humility." Fenton bowed his head. "Amen." And so the man who came to preach salvation left carrying the lesson instead. The soldier who burned for faith found mercy among ruins. And the child, born into a kingdom of fire, grew up beneath skies that finally knew rain. The river ran wide and quiet now, swollen with the season's rain. Its surface mirrored the sky, soft gray, restless, forgiving. The war was gone, but its memory floated downstream like driftwood that refused to sink. Liang Shun stood on the bank, watching Reverend Arthur Fenton's boat shrink toward the horizon. The missionary's figure was small, his white collar barely visible against the mist. Each oar stroke rippled the reflection of the clouds, until man and heaven blurred into one image. Yuen stood beside Liang, holding the smooth river stone Fenton had given back to him that morning. "Will he come back?" the boy asked. Liang's eyes stayed on the water. "He doesn't need to. Some people never leave. They just sail further inside us." A week later, a messenger arrived from the south. The empire was celebrating. The rebellion finally declared extinguished. Edicts were being carved on tablets, poems written to praise the emperor's mercy and might. Liang read the notice and smiled sadly. "Mercy," he murmured. "Even victory borrows words it doesn't understand." The messenger also carried a letter sealed in wax. Inside was a page torn from Fenton's journal. "To those who lived through the storm, remember, heaven was never lost. It was hidden in the hands that fed strangers, in the rain that refused to stop, in the small courage to be kind when obedience was easier. If the world ever again claims God as its weapon, remind it that his true kingdom has no walls." Liang folded the letter and tucked it into the same pouch that held Lin Mei's banner scrap. For the first time in years, he felt something like peace. Not loud, not triumphant, but still. The camp grew into a village by slow miracle. The refugees built clay homes, dug wells, planted rice in terraces that caught the morning light. They called the place Xinhe, New Harmony. When travelers passed, they said it was founded by former rebels who no longer spoke of rebellion. Liang taught the children to read, though he had never finished his own schooling. His lessons were stories of patience, of the folly of kings, of a God who did not speak in thunder but in the pauses between storms. At night, Yuen would sit by the fire and copy Fenton's English letters onto scrap parchment. "He said words can heal," the boy would say. "I think he was right." And Liang would answer, "Then write enough for both of us." One evening, as spring returned, Liang climbed the ridge above the village. The hills were green again, the air thick with the smell of rain-soaked earth. Below, the fields shimmered under the sunset. every rice stalk bending like a silent prayer. He thought of his wife, Malin, whose face memory still kept gentle, of Lin May and her steadfast courage, of Fenton rowing away into fog, of all the nameless souls who had died chasing heaven. He whispered to the wind, "We thought we could build your kingdom, Lord, but you were never lost. You were here, waiting for us to stop pretending." The wind moved through the willows as if in reply. Years passed. Yuen grew tall, strong, kind. The kind of man who could lift a fallen neighbor without waiting for thanks. Travelers came and went, some asking about the old rebellion. Liang never spoke of banners or thrones. He only said, "Once there was a fire that tried to swallow heaven, and heaven answered with rain." When Yuen finally left to study in a distant city, he carried Fenton's journal and the river stone in his satchel. He promised to return. Liang watched him go, his heart steady, his eyes shining with the light of something larger than regret. One autumn night, a traveler stopped at the village inn. He carried a foreign newspaper with brittle edges. On the front page was a small obituary. Arthur Fenton, missionary and humanitarian, died at sea returning to England. In his effects was found a journal titled "The Kingdom That Fell Upward." Liang traced the headline with a trembling finger and smiled through his tears. "He found his heaven after all," he whispered. That night, he walked to the stream where Lin Mei was buried. Moonlight turned the water silver. He set Fenton's letter beside her stone and said, "Your words have crossed the ocean now. They're free." A soft wind stirred and a willow leaf drifted into the current. It spun once, caught a glint of moonlight, and was gone. In the years that followed, the story of the heavenly kingdom faded from history's voice. The empire remembered only the numbers. Millions dead, cities burned, peace restored. But beneath that silence, in forgotten valleys, people still planted rice, still shared their last grain, still told their children about a God who wept through storms. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of kings or conquerors, heaven listened, not for praise, but for the sound of forgiveness taking root. Thus ended the tale of the Taiping Rebellion, not as a chronicle of war, but as a hymn of humbled faith. For when men tried to build heaven by force, God answered not with wrath, but with rain. And in that rain, he taught them again what it means to be human. And that is the story of a kingdom that tried to build heaven with its own hands and found mercy instead. In the end, it wasn't the armies, the thrones, or the prophets who taught faith's truest lesson. It was the rain and the quiet hearts that learned to forgive. What would you have done standing in their place? Would you have fought for heaven or waited for heaven to find you? Every event in history leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves questions about pride, mercy, and the divine patience that waits for us to listen. Perhaps that's what the Taiping Rebellion was really about. A world learning that faith, without compassion, builds only ashes. Thank you for being part of our little fireside circle tonight. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.